What did Jesus Christ look like? And what resources are there to answer that question? Let's take a look and answer that question together. So, what does the Bible say about Jesus' image? Well, as it turns out, the Bible tells very little about Jesus' image. We know from the scriptures that he was handsome, but common, Jewish, in his 30s, and we know that he wore a tunic, a pallium, and sandals. But it says virtually nothing about his facial features, his hair, facial hair, skin color, etc. But there are some passages in the Bible that people think tell us about Jesus' appearance, but these passages are not as clear and concrete as they might assume. One of those is Isaiah 50, verse 6. This is sometimes used to prove that Jesus had a beard. The problem is the interpretation and authenticity of this passage are questionable. The Dead Sea Scrolls have a different reading here, which proves that there are variants for this passage. The Septuagint has a different reading entirely and says nothing about a beard. It talks about Jesus being hit, which is a fulfillment of which is fulfilled in Matthew 26:67, which talks about Jesus being hit. Okay. And if we were to grant that this passage says Jesus has a beard, it would only mean that Jesus had a beard during his passion. It doesn't say anything about other times of his life. So Isaiah 50, verse 6, probably not the most concrete, most obvious example of Jesus having a beard. There's some questionability or some questionable interpretations there. Leviticus 19:27 is sometimes used to prove that Jesus had long hair, right? By saying that don't cut the sides of the hair. The problem is it doesn't say cutting or shaving. It says rounding, and it was likely interpreted by first century Jews as referring to curling the hair, not cutting it. As is found in the Septuagint. The Greek of the Septuagint is very clear that curls of the hair were intended, not cutting. So again, that proves nothing about his hair length. 1 Corinthians 11:14 seems to condemn long hair on men, but we know from early sources that exceptions existed around the time of Christ. We have the Nazarites, priests, prophets, philosophers are all known from early sources to have long hair. So, and even some Romans had long hair, according to the archaeology. So, and besides, Paul was a non-Judean writing to non-Judeans. So even Paul really doesn't tell us anything about Judean hairstyles. So no, 1 Corinthians 11:14 doesn't prove that Jesus had short hair. So these three sort of proof texts that people use to say, oh, Jesus had long hair, Jesus had short hair, Jesus had a beard, none of these is really proving anything about Jesus' appearance. And the truth is, the Bible provides no details about his bodily appearance, except that he might have had a beard during his passion. Okay, so I'll grant that that one might, maybe, but only in the Masoretic tradition, and only during his passion. So what about other ancient writings? Don't we have other accounts of how Jesus looked? Well, we don't have any accounts of Jesus's appearance, which are extant today, in extra biblical writings until the 15th century. It's super late, okay? And that's in the letter of Publius Lentulus. And this is supposedly an ancient Roman document that was discovered in the 15th century, and it describes in detail Jesus's appearance. But this is pretty much universally dismissed in the scholarship as being spurious and inauthentic, just because it's not quoted by anyone anywhere. It seems to contradict some of the earliest depictions of Christ that we have. And it just pops up so late, and we don't have the original manuscript, so we can't say anything about it. There's nothing in the Gospels, nothing in Josephus, nothing in Pliny, Tacitus, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, none of the apostolic fathers, and none of the stuff that we have today ever talks about Jesus's appearance. There's a few Gnostic writings which contain some vague descriptions of Jesus, but they're not specific and they're not reliable. And we know that they made fake images of Jesus anyways, from St. Hippolytus. So we don't even have descriptions of how Jews looked during Jesus' time. So not only do we not know how Jesus looked, but we don't even really know how Jews looked. And this is crazy, but what we think Jews looked like is actually largely based on Hollywood, the Jesus movies and things like that, and our own personal culture, and maybe some rabbinic Judaism in there. But if you do some introspection. How do you know what Jews looked like? Well, you're not going to find any strong, hard evidence under that investigation. So how about archaeology? What does archaeology tell us about how Jews looked during Jesus' time? Well, there's not much. There's not much in archaeology about how Judeans looked in the first century. We have first century frescoes of Romans in Pompeii, Herculaneum, Ephesus. We have pictures of Egyptians from the first century in the Fayum portraits, but we don't have anything from Judea. The closest we have is the Judea Capta coinage, and these are coins that were stamped in the first century, and it shows two people on the front, um, which might be Jews. So this could be a little tiny window into what Jews looked like. The problem is we're not really sure how to interpret this accurately. Is this a personification of Judah? Is this a typical Jewish man? What is this? We don't really know. So you can assume and say this is a typical Jewish man, but even if it is a Jewish man, what's to say that? Where do you get that this is how all Jews looked? Again, we don't know. We don't have any explanation of this image. No one says anywhere that this is how all Jews looked from this little coin from the first century. So, not the strongest proof for how Jews looked. We do have Dura Oropos. There's a synagogue there with Jewish frescoes, and this provides the closest window into how Jews understood Jews to look. And interestingly, it shows a diversity of hair and facial hairstyles. Okay, so you have some images of men with short hair, some with long hair, some with beards, some without beards. So even the earliest evidence we have of how Jews looked is diverse. So that doesn't really help us with determining how Jesus looked, because if we're going by the earliest Jewish art we have, even that indicates he could have one of many different styles. So I have some examples here from Dura Oropos. We have Elijah with long hair and a beard. We have resurrected Israelite men. This is from the prophecy of Ezekiel. And most of them have no beards. And all of them have relatively short hair. So that's interesting. Prophet Samuel has a very short beard and very short hair. King Solomon has no beard, but he has long hair. So even the earliest evidence we have, and this dates to the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, and these are Jewish paintings of Jews, even this is inconclusive about how Jews looked. So what about supernatural images? Well, we have the Mandylion, the image of Edessa, but there's some questions about the accuracy of the details in this account. The fact that there are multiple versions of the story within the Orthodox tradition raises a problem with its authenticity. The Orthodox feast day on August 16th seems to be local to Constantinople and dates to the 10th century. So 10th century is relatively late in church history, and outside of Constantinople, the feast day for the image of Edessa just doesn't seem to have been a big hit. In the West, they had their own version of this story and their own practices. So, I say this as a conservative Orthodox Christian, that the fact that there are multiple versions of the story within the Orthodox tradition really calls into question the accuracy of some of these details. And I'm not denying it. I'm not saying it's false or anything like that. I'm just saying if you're looking to this legend as a source of historical fact, I don't know if it's the right tool for the job. And by the way, if you don't know the story of the image of Edessa, according to the Byzantine version of the story, Jesus took a towel and pressed his face on the towel and gave it to a man, and Jesus' image was miraculously appearing on that towel, and then he brought it back to King Akbar, and then King Akbar had that as an icon of Christ. Okay. So not all versions of this story, though, show a supernatural origin of the image. The version in the Doctrine of Adi, it's just a painting by a painter. It's not a miraculous image at all. And that version of the story dates to the 5th century. The earliest versions, that are found in Eusebius or the letter of Darius to Augustine, they don't even mention an image at all. So again, we have multiple versions of the story, some with an image, some without an image, some the image is divine, some it's painted, and just there's just a diversity, and all of these fall within the Orthodox Christian world. It's not really clear which details from this story are accurate and which are not. So before you get mad at me, right, for being maybe a little bit skeptical about the details of the story, even Lossky questions the historical reliability of the conventional Byzantine version of the story. And he makes the point that the point of this image, the image made without hands, is not necessarily the historical accuracy, but the incarnational truth that it presents, that Jesus can be depicted as a man, which is a witness to his incarnation. That's the real takeaway from the story, not that it's every detail is correct. It was also apparently lost in the 13th century from Crusaders who invaded Constantinople. And while our copies are likely accurate to the original, this can't be verified. So we don't even have the original Mandylion. We can't confirm that our copies are really accurate to what was on that image. And by the 13th century, it's possible that that image had faded anyways. And then, of course, scientific analysis is impossible because we just don't have it. So there's too many questions, I would say, about this, the historicity of it, and our ability to analyze it. Whether or not the image was even there when our earliest copies were made is questionable. Okay, so what about the Veil of Veronica? What about the Shroud of Turin? Don't those tell us how Jesus looked? Well, in a way, they're similar to the Mandylion. Some scholars believe that these legends are intermingled with the Mandylion. Okay, so for example, the existence of the shroud maybe led to the legend of the Mandylion. But really, the only point I need to make on these, authentic or not, is that even if we grant the truth of the Shroud of Turin, the Veil of Veronica, they only show Jesus during the time of his passion. They don't say anything about how he looked during his ministry years. So my takeaway from these legends, and I'm not saying they're all false or anything like that. I'm just saying that it's a little bit messy, and it's really difficult to say anything concrete about these images, the copies we have, just because there's so much history and there's versions of these stories and there's questions about scientific methods and things like that. So if you want to believe these, that's absolutely fine. I don't think it contradicts anything. I'm just saying if you're looking for a really concrete source for how did Jesus look, I don't know if these are going to be satisfying for you. So that leads us to the value of ancient iconography. In my opinion, considering all the available resources, iconography is the best early witness we have for the appearance of Jesus. We have hundreds of images of Jesus dating solidly from the 3rd century throughout to the present, right? From the 3rd through 6th centuries from the early church. Some are dated by certain scholars as early as the 2nd century. And many of these survive because they're made of stone, they're made of glass, they're buried, they're wax embedded in plaster and buried. It's really durable stuff. So these images survive a long time, and our oldest images of Christ are 1,000 years older than our earliest written account. Again, that 15th century written account is 1,000 years later than our earliest images of Jesus. And in fact, our oldest images of Christ are equally as old as our oldest New Testament manuscripts and older than our oldest complete Bibles. So we have complete images of Jesus, which are older than complete Bibles, which is kind of crazy. But there's this phenomenon in the archaeology that we have biblical manuscripts in one transmission line, but we also have iconography in another transmission line, and they run parallel, and they're equally as old. So our witnesses to the gospel in the Bible, are paralleled with our witnesses to the gospel in iconography, and they go back to the same antiquity. So I have Ryland's Library Papyrus P52. This is a famous fragment from the Gospel of John that's dated to the 2nd century. Well, here's a painting of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, which also dates to the 2nd century, according to Joseph Wilpert. So again, it's really, really neat, but we have ancient iconography that's just as old as our oldest witnesses to the New Testament. So in conclusion, we just don't have much about Jesus's appearance from the Bible or ancient writings or archaeology, okay, Jewish archaeology. Supernatural images of Jesus are difficult to say anything concrete about, so I'm not dismissing them, but it's just difficult from a scholarly perspective to really base anything on those. And again, the Shroud of Turin, if it's authentic, it really only speaks about his passion times. And I think as for me, I'm interested in how did he look for his whole life, not just in one snapshot of his life. And early Christian iconography, on the other hand, in contrast to the other resources, is abundant with images of Christ. There's hundreds of them, like I said. And by the way, they're all over the place. It's not just in Rome. We have some in Syria. We have one in England. We have some in France and Spain, Germany. They're all over the place. So we have geographical and antiquity witnesses from the iconography. Our earliest images of Christ date back to the 2nd century by some scholars, at least to the early 3rd century. And our oldest images of Christ are as old as our oldest New Testament manuscript witnesses. So all that to say, if you're asking the question, what did Jesus look like? I would suggest looking at ancient Christian iconography. But of course, the iconography it brings up questions of interpretation because there's some diversity there in how Jesus looked. So this is one part of this whole puzzle of putting together how did Jesus look from early Christian iconography. That's all for this video. If you have any questions, please leave a comment and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.